Hello everyone, this is Alan G., your host of True Crime Man's Dark Imagination. If you like what you see, hit the like button, hit subscribe, and hit the bell so you'll be notified of any future episodes. This particular presentation has to do with a chapter from my most recently published book, Southern Evil. It has to do with an unlikely Southern belle who was looking for love in all the wrong places. She developed a knack for getting rid of husbands and collecting insurance money and not seeing anything wrong with that. For most of her life, Nancy Hazel, later to be called Nanny, loved two things: romance magazines and prunes. An odd combination indeed, but oh so necessary in sustaining herself day to day. That is, to keep her fresh as a daisy despite the reality of the world's disappointments. Romance, or at least the conception of it, provided her with an escape into a reverie of delightful images of knights in shining armor carrying her off to Wonderland. Prunes, known for their medicinal power of natural elimination, helped her carry out another type of elimination, one husband after another. When arrested, she chuckled, and she continued to chuckle through the ensuing police interrogation, even as she named the men she killed, prune-fed and unsuspecting. The press dubbed her the Giggling Granny and the Jolly Widow. Whether because of embarrassment or to cover a mean streak that she burned rabid inside. A side she wouldn't allow herself to emanate for all to see. She never quite showed remorse, repentance, nor for that matter, a real understanding of her crimes. She went to prison for life, giggling. Nannie Doss got around. She was found to have killed 4 husbands, one in Alabama, one in North Carolina, one in Kansas, and one in Oklahoma. The last one, Samuel Doss, for whose murder she was eventually tried and convicted. And there are other purported victims as well. Nanny is also alleged to have killed her mother, 2 of her 4 daughters, a mother-in-law, and other family members, either by her favorite form of homicide, prunes salted with rat arsenic, or through one or another spontaneous means of annihilation. Sherby Green, a distant cousin of the accused murderer, stated, "My great-grandmother and Nanny's mother were sisters. That makes me a cousin twice removed. My family doesn't like to talk about Nanny. She's the bloodline black sheep, the skeleton in our closet." Born to poor farming parents in Blue Mountain, a tiny hamlet nestled in the bottomlands of Alabama's northeast hill country, Nancy Hazel's life promised little glamour, meager romance. Glamour did not attract her, but of love, she would spend a lifetime pursuing it. The nearest claim to fame she had, and it was little, was that her Grandma Holder was remotely related to the Lincoln family that produced Honest Abe. Nancy's mother, Lulisa, Lou for short, was a caring creature, though deathly afraid of her husband, one hot-tempered James Hazel. There is some evidence that Nancy was born before Lou married James. Census records right after Nancy's birth in 1905 show Lou as living alone with a daughter. James appears to have come on the scene later. From where or exactly when he appeared is a mystery. Nancy's childhood wasn't happy. Nancy became known by this nickname at an early age, wandered aimlessly on an erratic schedule to and from and around school. Sometimes she went, other times she didn't. So did a trio of sisters and a brother who came after her. If their father wanted the kids on the farm that morning to help with the field work, the never-ending field work, the entire brood stayed home. After all, James Hazel was the boss, and, if rumors are correct, he wouldn't spare the switch on his daughter nor his wife to get what he wanted. By the age of 5, Nanny was made to cut wood, plow the fields, and clear the land of weed and debris. Ball games and seeing friends were forbidden. And when Nanny was able to traipse to school, well, that was hard work too. It was a 2-mile walk and 2 miles back. Of fun, there was none. If the Hazels' lights stayed on late into the evening, it was to finish the pots and pans and the sweeping required in the little house, or to mend a shutter or clean out the dustbin. Before the crow of the cock, it was up and out of bed, old man Hazel grunting, into your calicos and hurry down to the harvest. In an interview Nanny gave to Life magazine in her later life, she tended to blame her adult problems on a head injury she received when she was 7 years old. She had gone with her family to visit a relative in downstate Alabama. The train ride was the thrill of her young life. She'd never been off the farm, much the less on a vacation to anywhere. But when the locomotive was forced to make an emergency stop, Nanny jolted forward to slam her head on the iron seat frame in front of her. She suffered pains and blackouts for months, and headaches the remainder of her life, she asserted. While some writers with a social bent point to the train accident as the cause of her dementia to come, relatives point out that Nanny just had a plain old mean streak. Many members of the family carried a fierce pride and a tough reputation. While they didn't take lives, they were nonetheless hard people. Nanny had terrible mood swings, dreamed of love and of finding her own Prince Charming. Her only interest was her mother's romantic magazines, and she would sit for hours in her bedroom just looking at the loving couples staring out at her from the pages. As she grew older, her favorite bits were the ads for the Lonely Hearts Clubs. The early 1900s were the age of romantic frivolity, when every female wanted to look like a Gibson girl, cherubic and lovely at all angles. Men were the bosses in their high-starch collars and walrus mustaches. But all of society knew it was the feminine sex who, under coy smile and blossoming fragrance, really ruled the world. As Nanny entered dating age, she was held back from the ready boys of Calhoun County by a father who saw Nanny and her 3 sisters as field hands that he wasn't too eager to give up. He forbade them from attending the church socials and the Saturday night hootenannies at Crispin's Tavern or the community hall. Makeup was outlawed. Silk stockings were considered sinful, fixed hair hell-bent, and form-fitting dresses absolutely slutty. No daughter of his would tempt the male libido. When the time came, he often growled. He would pick the husbands for his daughters. Weekend nights would find the sisters Hazel staring in sorrow at the flickering lights in so-and-so's barn down the road, where a dance was in progress. They were barred from its premises by Papa Hazel, but at least they could watch the glow of the lanterns bouncing in rhythm to the neighborhood mandolins and the stomp, only a muffle to their far-off ears, of the feet of the rest of Blue Mountain's youths having a hell of a time. Nanny, however, did manage to sneak away here and there, and learned if the hayloft or the corn crib was the only place to please the boys and get a little loving herself away from James Hazel's eyes, then where was the harm? The boys liked her. Her hair was dark, her eyes were dark, and her giggle was bright. Plus, she was easy. Lou might have known of her daughter's escapades, but kept quiet. Her reconciliation may have been that if Nanny came with child, then at least she would be able to do something that the mama herself was unable to do. Get away from the dictator. Evidently, Squire Hazel approved of young Charlie Braggs, Nanny's attentive co-worker at Linen Thread Company where she went to work in 1921. Tall, handsome, curly-haired, he hung on 16-year-old Nanny's shadow and doted. The elder Hazel noted that, unlike the other boys in Blue Mountain who idled their time in cafes and at parties, playing those crazy jazz records coming out of New York, Charlie's main preoccupation, even above Nanny, was his mother. His paycheck supported her, and he treated the old lady like the Queen of Alabama. That was good, estimated James Hazel. Good old-fashioned respect for his elders, something his own daughters could learn. Braggs was in like flint, and within 4 months after bringing the boy home for supper one casual day, Nanny found herself walking down the aisle on her way to marital bliss, whether she wanted it or not. Years later, Nanny wrote,
I married as my father wished, in 1921 to a boy I only knowed about 4 or 5 months who had no family, only a mother who was unwed and who had taken over my life completely when we were married. She never seen anything wrong with what he'd done, but she would take spells. She would not let my own mother stay all night.
Rephrased, Nanny hadn't lost a demanding papa. She gained a mother-in-law of identical cloth. If Nanny wanted to dine out and Mrs. Braggs didn't, the latter would contract a dizzy spell or a stomach cramp until her son was forced to relent. They stayed in. If Nanny wanted to attend the picture show at the Bijou and Mrs. Braggs didn't, the symptoms would return, and they'd spend the evening at home playing mahjong at the kitchen table. The Braggs had 4 daughters within a 4-year period. The first, Melvina, in 1923, and the last, Florine, in 1927. Pressures from raising babies, pleasing Mother Braggs, and cooking for a ravenous husband mounted. She began to partake of the family's liquor closet, and what had been a casual smoking habit escalated to chronic. Eventually, these built-up tensions exploded within her. Her only recourse was to cry on the shoulders of strangers. Between pregnancies, she found time to see Coventry and Blue Mountain's assorted gin mills, where drunken men pawed at her and drooled over her, and made her feel that she was still attractive. Her indiscretions were fairly easy to pull off because she chose to effect them when Braggs himself was inebriated and cozy in the arms of another woman or 2 on the outskirts of town. He would disappear for days, she later testified, forgetting to remind herself that she looked forward to his binges and hers. The marriage was down and up, mostly down, flat on its back. Having both found sexual satisfaction in others, even the marriage bed, the one factor that might have kept them together, albeit carnally, faded. Their sexual AWOLs increased, and if the couple happened to be together once a week, say at the dinner table, it was quite by accident. Early in 1927, the Braggs lost 2 middle daughters, both suspected of food poisoning. Each child seemed fine at breakfast, but had died by lunchtime. Although the local medics called their deaths accidental, Charlie Braggs wasn't convinced. He evidently had seen something wrong in Nanny's cold eyes up close. He soon bolted, taking his oldest daughter, Melvina, his pet, with him. He left newborn Florine behind. Of the 2 deceased children, although there is no proof, there is little doubt that their mother conscientiously slew them. Overwhelmed and unable to cope with the responsibilities of her situation, with her own reality, Nanny simply and cold-heartedly trashed those 2 extra mouths to feed. To her, it was a matter of deadly economics. Braggs had gone on record to state that he was frightened of his wife, as was his mother and the rest of his family. He never drank or ate anything that she prepared when in a foul mood. Those at the time who knew her less intimately than Charlie might have laughed at his suspicions, for she always appeared domestic and happy. She ceremoniously outlined every meal, complete with coffee for Charlie and milk for the kids. When hubby left this time with Melvina, it wasn't for his usual 3 or 4 days. This time he disappeared for months. His mother had died in the meantime, a natural death, and he remained apart from something he was afraid of. Not knowing where he had gone or if he would return, Nanny was forced to take a job at the nearest cotton mill to support herself and Florine. Charlie finally reappeared in Blue Mountain in late summer 1928, a year after he had departed. He brought back with him more than himself and Melvina. He came arm in arm with another woman, a divorcee, and her own child. Few words were spoken between the awkward adults, and Nanny took the hint. She packed her personal belongings, dressed her 2 daughters, and left, cursing Charlie, cursing Charlie's girlfriend, cursing her own bad fortune. Just cursing. Charlie is known as the husband who got away. Husbands number 2, 3, 4, and 5 wouldn't see the handwriting on the wall that he had seen. They died horrible deaths. After her breakup with Charlie Briggs, Nanny found employment in a cotton mill in Anniston, just outside Blue Mountain. Hours were long and hot, but it gave her the excuse she wanted to get out of the house and away from her nagging parents, to whose house she had returned. It was an equal compromise. Mama Lou Hazel enjoyed watching over her grandkids, and Nanny appreciated the interesting glances she was receiving from the boys in the shop. But she didn't want to make the same mistake, marrying another immature dungaree mountain boy with a mother complex, nor one with his wandering ways. Even though she had spent a good portion of her married life in other men's beds, she acted as if she herself believed it was Charlie's womanizing that caused the divorce. Nanny turned wide-eyed to the Lonely Hearts column in the local newspaper, writing fastidiously to a number of men whose advertisements interested her. Only one of their responses engaged her, however, that from 23-year-old factory worker Frank Harrelson, who wrote pretty verse and whose black and white Kodak photo looked even prettier, what with the dimpled cheeks like Clark Gable and the wavy hair like Grant Withers. In return, she sent him a cake, a picture of herself, and pert words that edged on the essence of sex. Since Harrelson lived in nearby Jacksonville, he fired up his flivver and headed straight south to Blue Mountain. On her door stoop, waiting, he found an alluring young thing, more magnetic than the photos she had sent. The picture hadn't captured that twist of amour that sparkled so a fire in her black eyes. He proposed, she accepted. They married in 1929. The rains came and went, the autumn leaves fell, and they made love by crackling log fires in the winter. But all the time, drink was part of Frank's life. As the months went on, the honeymoon period crumbled, and Nanny realized that her tall, good-looking husband with the square chin and rugged features was an alcoholic. Not only that, but she discovered much to her chagrin that he had spent time in jail for felonious assault. Gentleman Frank was no gentleman. When she wed this disappointment-to-be, Nanny had taken her 2 daughters from Grandma Hazel's tender, loving care, a place they liked being, and brought them with her to Jacksonville. There was no recorded testimony of the girls' experience with, nor their opinion of their stepfather, but they must have been in for a shock. Too young to have clearly recalled the shouting bouts between their natural father and mother, their earliest memories probably lay in their days and nights with Lou Hazel. Now they were old enough to understand what it all meant when the Jacksonville cops showed up at their door a couple of times every week to tell Nanny that Harrelson was in the brig, again, for brawling drunk in a gutter. And they saw Nanny's dark face and comprehended her dark moods, sometimes sinister, each time she had to fetch the wavering and slur-tongued Harrelson from the hoosegow. Life went on. Strangely, Nanny abided for many years. Her husband's drinking rarely let up, but she abided. He even smacked her around in his most drunken state, but she abided. He'd yell at and threaten her growing kids for nothing, but she abided again. Black and blue, forlorn and unloved, in tatters and lace, she abided. The marriage would last 16 years. We're not supposed to get the impression that Nanny was a sympathetic character. She simply had not yet discovered how to rid herself of a husband. That was to come. Nanny had learned to kill. Perhaps she was merely practicing her skills and at the same time building her nerve for the big day when Frank Harrelson was to go. She had already, it seemed, disposed of 2 infant daughters, so killing children had little effect on her. They were extra baggage. By the early 1940s, their surviving daughters, Melvina and Florine, had grown and married. Melvina bore a son, Robert, in 1943, and in February 1945 went into labor again. This pregnancy was hard on the smallish woman. Frightened and suffering racking pains this time around, she called for her mother to be by her side at the local hospital. Melvina's husband, Mosey Haynes, fetched Nanny. Like a good mother, Nanny remained on duty throughout the night, wiping her daughter's scalding forehead and comforting her during the ordeal. She ordered Mosey to fetch continual glasses of water, wet towels, this and that, and to keep the attending nurses and interns stepping lively dusk to dawn. Mosey, of course, didn't complain, and like a good grandmother, Nanny celebrated with her daughter and son-in-law when Melvina produced a lovely little girl. Within the hour, the child died. Details are sketchy as best. Mosey had fallen asleep on the chair in the hospital room, and Melvina, in a state of semi-consciousness from the surgery ether, lay prone in her bed. At one point, she happened to glance over at her mother and the newborn cradled in her arms. But Melvina perceived that she was never afterwards able to determine as a truth or nightmare. She thought she saw Nanny sticking a hatpin into the child's tender head. The dream bothered Melvina, especially since the doctors could not account for the child's death. Back at home, a few days later, Melvina told her husband and Florine about what she thought she had seen. Her confidants were startled. They had seen Grandma Nanny toying with such a pin, turning it over and over between her fingers earlier in the evening. 6 months later, Melvina's son also passed away while in Nanny's care. The daughter had gone to stay with her father, Charlie Braggs, after a fight with Mosey, leaving Robert with Nanny. How little Robert Lee Haynes died was a mystery. Nanny seemed heartbroken. She didn't know what happened. The doctors diagnosed his death as asphyxia from unknown causes, and she played the grieving grandmother right up to the lowering of his tiny coffin graveside. She fainted, she wailed, and she blew despair. Then several months later, she collected a $500 life insurance check on a policy that she had taken out on the boy. Having refined her skills in murder and theatrics, she was now ready to take on the bigger game, Frank Harrelson. She waited for the opportunity and, perhaps to ease her conscience just a little bit, a provocation. International events had thrust America into a world war. American GIs were dying by the droves in Europe and the Pacific, and the world had little time to note the deaths of an infant girl and a 2-year-old boy in an out-of-the-way burg in the foothills of northeastern Alabama. In August 1945, the last of the enemy powers, Japan, surrendered. The nation thought of one thing: to welcome home its fathers, brothers, and sons. In every state of the Union, there was hailing and bunting and balloons and all-round ecstasy. Alabama was no exception. On the night of September 15, 1945, Frank Harrelson went out to a tavern to welcome home some friends from overseas. Tonight, patriotism had given him an excuse to get loaded. Arriving home, he was still in a festive mood. He wanted sex, fireworks style, and he wanted it fast. When Nanny refused, he slammed the wall with a ham-sized fist and shouted, "If and you don't listen to me, woman, I ain't gonna be here next week." She listened to him, just to avoid a broken jaw. As they had sex, Nanny stared at the ceiling and vowed to get even. The next day, tending to the little rose garden she adored, she found her husband's corn liquor jar hidden deep in the surrounding flower bed. That was enough. She liked to keep her yard pretty. She took the jar to the storeroom, poured away some of the foul drink, and topped it with rat poison. That evening, Harrelson died of excruciating pain, aged just 38. An hour later, Nanny washed out the empty corn liquor jar. She later stated that she married him for love, but like all her amours, she loved the continental sound of that word. Frank Harrelson was no Sir Lancelot. Instead, he was a jailbird and a drunkard, and now he was a dead husband. Killing husbands became easier after that. Killing, in general, had become a cinch. There is a brief period in Nanny's life that is unaccounted for. It is believed that she traveled around the country by rail, possibly north to New York, or west to as far as Idaho. What she did on these excursions is anyone's guess. She may have even been married to a man named Hendricks. Certain records indicate that, but the police never followed it up. Did Mr. Hendricks fall fate to Nanny's temperament? Wherever Nanny roamed after Harrelson's death, she eventually wound up in the scenic little town of Lexington, North Carolina, in response to another Lonely Hearts column. The year was 1947, and the husband-to-be this time was laborer Arley Lanning, an ex-Alabaman. After meeting her for the first time, the couple married 2 days later. Arley believed their marriage was set in heaven, where he was later to be dispatched. Life with Arley wasn't as dramatically chaotic as it had been with Harrelson, partly because for most of the time Nanny wasn't home. Whereas her former spouse had been the prodigal, Nanny now mimicked him. Whenever things got hectic, whenever Arley drank too much and flirted too much, he too, like his predecessor, loved his alcohol and his females. Nanny pulled the suitcase from her closet and went away to parts unknown, sometimes for months on end. She would leave without a word. Or maybe she would leave a message on a crumpled up piece of paper under the salt shaker. Gone. Occasionally, Arnie would receive a cablegram, send money, or be home soon. The wires came from all directions. She seemed not to remain in one place too long. She simply darted as if on an escape route from responsibility. Out of the blue, she would come home. Arley, not brutal like Frank had been, would merely shrug a hello. That is, if he wasn't unconscious on the sofa from drink. For a while, he and Nanny would play loving couple. He knew the reason she took flight so often was because, or so she claimed, his drinking binges and his womanizing. So upon her return, he always committed to the dry wagon, a promise that he, and probably he too, knew would be busted maybe days, weeks, or if luck was with him, months ahead. When on the home front, Nanny acted the perfect wife for the benefit of her neighbors. Her trips away would be explained as visits to friends and family. In part they were true, for Nanny would occasionally bus to Gadsden, Alabama, to tend to visit her sister Lovey, who had contracted cancer, or visit Arley's 84-year-old mother, who lived in a nearby town and needed help house cleaning and canning. Nanny's favorite pastime was television, that modern new wonder box that brought into America's homes live stage shows, teleplays, and stand-up comedians. When a love story was to be aired, one didn't dare bother Nanny. She would pull up her most comfortable chair, a plate of leftovers, her pack of Camels, the ashtray, and lose herself in a grayscale kaleidoscope of heartthrobs and kisses. That world had yet to take seed in Nanny's world, but at least she could envision it more focally now, compliments of her RCA. In Lexington, Nanny was an avid churchgoer, and she had become intimate with the minister's family and many of the families in the Methodist congregation. Arley Lanning, during sober periods, would accompany his wife to Sunday morning services and remained at her side afterwards for the tea socials and picnics hosted by the Ladies' Auxiliary, to which Nanny belonged. But there were whispers among the attendees at these functions generated by the presence of Mr. Lanning. His reputation, to be blunt, preceded him. Before and during his marriage to Nanny, he was often seen in the lower Lexington dives with one of the floozies who hung there. Arley was a rapscallion, said the fine people of the Lexington Methodist Church, and poor Nanny. Well, they didn't know if she was aware of his maneuverings, but be it far from them to break her heart. Behind closed doors, in quiet conversation, Lanning was the town's villain, she its travailing martyr. When the town turned out then for Arley's funeral in February 1950, it was out of great respect for the heartbroken widow, not the corpse. Yes, Arley had died suddenly. Cause, heart failure. Of course, there was something that had caused the heart to fail, the doctor said, but in cases like Arley's, where there was absolutely no reason for suspicion, it would be superfluous to conduct an autopsy. Any number of things could have caused him to lie in pain as he did for a couple of days before succumbing. Most likely, it had been the dangerous flu virus that had been sweeping the state, striking some people worse than others. He had had all the symptoms: sweating, vomiting, dizziness, and, after all, the doctor admitted, Arley's body was not in the best shape, his stomach already half gone with the drink, his heart already weakened. He just sat down one morning to drink a cup of coffee and eat a bowl of prunes I had specially prepared for him, Nanny admitted to her neighbors gathered around his coffin. Up until then, why, let me tell you, he looked in fine shape. Then, well, 2 days later, dead. I nursed him, believe me, I nursed him, but I failed. And for an extra touch, she dabbed her eyes with her kerchief. Poor, poor Arley. You know what he said to me before he breathed his last? Nanny, he said, Nanny, it must have been the coffee. On April 21st, 1950, 8 weeks after Arley's passing, the tidy frame home that he and Nanny had lived in burned to the foundation. It was a stroke of luck for the widow because, had the house survived, it would have, under conditions set forth in Arley's will, gone to his sister. Coincidentally, Nanny was not home at the time, having just left the premises with her favorite household item, the TV set, tucked away in the back seat of her Ford. "I was on my way to have it repaired," she explained. As it were, the insurance company issued a check to Arley Lanning, deceased, which was mailed to his widow, who was lodging by then with Arley's mother. The claimant expediently cashed the check and left North Carolina, but only after the elder Mrs. Lanning died strangely in her sleep. Within days, Nanny showed up at her sister Dovey's residence in Gadsden with the TV, where she nursed the bedridden sibling whose condition from that point seemed to continue downhill. Dovey died June 30th, also in her sleep. Apparently, anything that annoyed Arsenic Annie, another name given to Nanny during her eventual trial, met with elimination. And if killing people brought in a little extra income, an insurance policy here or there, well, she considered that a bonus. Payment for her cleverness, if you will. And fitting with her dark side, Nanny was clever. Very, very intelligent. It's been said that she was able to get away with her crimes because of the backwards places she lived and the naive times. That's simply not true. Where and when she lived had nothing to do with it. The temperament of the people she familiarized. They can be quite suspicious and alert to hypocrisy. But Nanny was an actress. She fooled so many people, laymen and professionals, during a killing spree that lasted more than 20 years. The Diamond Circle Club was a correspondence association for those looking for life partners. Membership was $15 per year. Suitors and ladies received a monthly newsletter regaling the newest members and their heart's desires. Nanny was enthralled. By 1952, she was at it again. Nanny's hips had fattened by now, she wore glasses, and the once pretty profile had taken on a double chin. She found that she didn't turn heads the way she used to, and decided that maybe the time had come to seek admiration in the eyes of a more mature type of male. Curly-headed boys were passé. Maybe she had needed all along a real man anyway, she surmised. And she thought she had found him in a recently retired businessman, Richard L. Morton of Emporia, Kansas. While her girth had widened and her temples had slightly grayed, Nanny still carried a girlish giggle, and she knew how to use it to entice. She had learned how and when to turn on the flash in her eyes, and at age 47, she proved more capable than ever of shaping, at a whim, the two beams in bedposts. Morton, a former salesman of routine coolness, bought for a change. The old boy was transfixed. She was the gal for him, and to prove it, he wrote Diamond Circle, asking them to delete his and Nanny's names from the availability list, and thanking them for introducing him to the sweetest and most wonderful woman I have ever met. They wed in October 1952, and she moved into his little home in Emporia. Kansas's eternal plains were vastly different from the mountain greenery Nanny had known for her whole life. For a while, the sight of surrounding horizon thrilled her. She was happy in the arms of her man under that endless sky. Half American, Indian. He was tall, dark and handsome, with eyes that pierced like arrows straight to her romantic daydreams. As well, he bought her things, clothes, jewelry, and knickknacks, never seemingly worried about the price of adornments he thrust upon her. Reality, however, waited around the next cornstalk. Within months of their marriage, Morton manifested as flat as the countryside. He was, despite his flair, broke, deep in debt to everyone. And when he did buy her a bauble on whatever credit he managed to effect through charming circumlocution, he also bought a double for another girl he had stashed away in town. Morton's occasional trips to the stores in his Chevy pickup truck to buy this and that for the house and farm struck Nanny as being rather lengthy for casual jaunts. They became more prolonged each time. If prodded why so long, the husband would reply with an air of apathy, "Oh, just dawdled, I guess." She investigated and discovered that he was seeing someone he had known before he married and seemed to have no intention of dropping. Nanny had made a mistake, but Morton had made a bigger one. She picked a phony. He chose a killer. By Christmas, 2 months after she tied the knot, Nanny was again answering other gentlemen's ads from the forlorn columns in Kansas's papers. She'd be sure to fetch the mail every day from the mailbox. Then, if a letter from one of her admirers had arrived, she would sneak off with it to the bathroom. In silence, she would swoon over their remonstrations of love. The writers, thinking she was a widow, offered to sweep her away from her troubles to promises of marital bliss. Each sentimental "till we at last meet, Nanny," or "hoping to see you soon, Nanny," whisked Nanny a step closer to ridding herself of the thing beyond the bathroom door who, to her, had grown ugly and repulsive. Husband number 4 was destined for the ground, but he might have been spared a couple of months when Papa James Hazel died in Blue Mountain and Mama Lou suddenly announced that she was coming to board with the couple. With Mama there, the daughter's murderous designs were delayed, well, at least on Morton. By all accounts, Nanny performed the unthinkable. She murdered her mother. Whether Lou's money was the object or whether she got in the way of Nanny's plot against Morton, perhaps Mama may have gotten a glimpse of one of Nanny's intimate letters. The motive here is unclear. Nanny would always vehemently deny poisoning Lou, but considering the hasty manner in which all the others had died after crossing Nanny's path, as well as the preceding symptoms of death, it seems very likely that her mother did not die naturally. In retrospect, Nanny had grown totally devoid of heart. Had she won at the outset, this latest act shows a lack of sympathy, loyalty, and conscience. 3 months after Louisa was buried in the earth, her latest son-in-law, Richard Morton, joined her. He died of similar symptoms, and still no one, family, friends, neighbors, and doctors, asked questions. Sam Doss was a sturdy, solid man and a God-fearing man. He didn't chase women, never smoked, never drank, refused to play dice, and lacked the effort to exhale a single cuss word. He was careful about his appearance, thrifty with his bank account, never riled, loved nature, and saw the good in almost everything. Sam Doss was unbelievably, irrevocably boring. At least Nanny found him so. At 59 years old, his clean living emanated across his surface. He looked younger and he looked healthy. His conservative haircut and tidy manner or dress gave him a wealthy appearance, a trusting appearance, and maybe one or both of these suggestions had drawn Nanny to his side when he proposed to her in June 1953. Nanny was a widow. That's all he knew, and all he cared to know. Like his pennies, he counted his blessings, and this fine, smiling, good cook of a woman was what he wanted in his later life. Someone who preferred home and hearth, who would stay by his side until death them part. He was exceedingly correct, if not foresighted, on the latter supposition. Sam had been one of Nanny's pen pal paramours. After Richard Morton began pushing up daisies, she grabbed the first bus out to meet Doss in his hometown of Tulsa, Oklahoma. At first, he provided his bride with a refreshing detour from all her past mates. He worked a steady job. He was a state highway inspector, spoke softly and succinctly, and often wore a necktie. He helped around the house, helped her cook, and did not portray the king of the house attitude so many of the others had. Certainly, he was neither threatening nor violent. But he was set in his ways that irritated the less conservative wife. Christian women don't need a television or romance magazines to be happy, Samuel Doss said. Words that sealed his fate. He did not believe in the wasteful reading of cheap magazines or romance novels. He saw them as evil idleness. Radio and television were products meant to enrich the mind, which meant that comedies and love stories were taboo. Bedtime came promptly at 9:30 p.m., an agenda he followed like an automaton, and to which he expected his wife to adhere. Sex was pre-scheduled. Spending patterns came hardline. One never used the electric fan until temperatures exceeded the unbearable. Lights room to room were frugally used, turned on only when entering and turned off immediately upon leaving. When reading, only the reading lamp behind the easy chair would be illumined in an otherwise darkened chamber. Furniture was costly, so doilies were prevalent to preserve upholstery. When the pinching of pennies and the die-hard living became overbearing, Nanny took a hiatus home to Alabama. Most likely, it was strategy, and if so, it worked. The moment she escaped, he was hot on her trail with letters pleading forgiveness. To show his earnestness, he opened up his pocketbook to let her enjoy the life to which she was more accustomed. And when she continued to balk that he still controlled the finances, He rearranged his banking account to give her equal liberty, and he took out 2 life insurance policies naming her as the beneficiary. A big-time blunder on Sam's part. On a cool September evening, Doss sat at the dinner table, sliding his cleaned-off dinner plate aside to partake of Nanny's prune cake. That night, he began wrenching, grasping his stomach in violent pain. Spasms were ungodly. He took to his bed for days, losing 16 pounds in weight. Finally, his doctor sent him to the hospital, where he stayed for 23 days. The hospital's diagnosis had been a severe infection to the digestive tract. Upon his release, October 5th, Nanny, disgruntled at the time wasted, went right back to where she had left off. Right back. After allowing him one good afternoon's rest back in his own overstuffed chair, she awoke him for the dinner she had prepared especially for his welcome home. "This will get you back on your feet in a jiffy," she promised, passing him a cup of coffee first. Doss sipped it first, and then as it cooled took a larger and larger gulp each time between a mouthful of delicious pork roast. The roast was fine. The coffee was the harbinger, mixed with arsenic. Before the toll of midnight, Sam Doss was dead. In a rush to rid herself of her latest and by far not the greatest husband, Nanny erred, using a draught. She had been too much in a hurry this time around. Dr. Schwelbein, the physician who examined Doss prior to his release from the hospital only the day before, dismayed to hear that his patient was dead. This, he said, did not make sense. He ordered an autopsy. As he had suspected, Sam Doss had not died of natural causes. In the intestines and stomach, Schwelbein found remains of a pork roast dinner and enough arsenic to kill a team of horses. Nannie Doss, unable to explain where the arsenic came from, was promptly arrested. At first, when questioned by police, Nanny refused to acknowledge her role in Sam Doss's poisoning. He was her husband, she said, and wouldn't have harmed him. But the police wouldn't let up. Arsenic, they reminded her, does not come naturally with pork meat or coffee beans. In fact, when Sam was admitted into a hospital a month earlier, he had just devoured a plate full of her prunes. "Were they poisoned too, Nanny?" they asked. "I don't know what you're talking about," she giggled at the ridiculousness of the line of questioning. "Me? Poison?" Hour after hour they drilled her, trying to get her to pay attention to them, and never mind the copy of the romance magazine she kept thumbing through. "Put the magazine down, Nanny, and listen to us. Nanny, look at us. Why did you kill Doss?" Special Agent Ray Page, heading the investigation, signaled his own men aside and stepped forward. He lit a cigarette and sat beside her at the long table in the dim, tunnel-like interrogation room and rubbed a pair of tired eyes. He noted with surprise that, unlike himself and his squad, she had not wilted at all. "We've made phone calls, Nanny, and we've learned that Mr. Doss was your 4th husband to die of the same symptoms. We're putting the 2 and 2 together. Nanny, it looks like we just might come up with, 4. Arsenic, Nanny, we believe that they all died of arsenic. It will be easier if you admit what you have done ahead of time, before we have to find out ourselves." "Are you saying, young man, that I killed my husbands?" And she giggled again. "You're a nice-looking young man, but so foolish." And she flipped over a page of the Romantic Hearts publication before her. Page did not know whether to laugh or cry. Was she insane? Or was she the greatest actress who ever lived? Move over, Betty Davis, he thought. He'd seen some cool cucumbers in these days, but this woman had them all beat. It was time to get serious with Old Mother Arsenic. He reached over and drew the magazine from her hands. "No more reading, Nanny. This isn't the Christian Science reading room. You're going to answer us." She looked at him, not giggling. "Nanny," he went on, "there are others too, aren't there? A lot of people around you dropped dead over the last couple of decades, and their ghosts are coming back to haunt you. They're here, Nanny, in this room. Put 'em to rest, Nanny. Put 'em to rest." For a moment their eyes met. Page detected, in a breath, those twinkling granny eyes solidly into something nasty. A devil lurked just within, and he was going to yank it out. And she knew it. She sighed, heaved, and nodded. All right. Then she giggled again, those eyes turning innocent once more. But at least she began to talk. She confessed to poisoning Doss's coffee, but not out of maliciousness. "He wouldn't let me watch my favorite programs on television," she commenced, "and he made me sleep without the fan on the hottest nights. He was a miser, and well, what's a woman to do under those conditions?" The detectives in the room exchanged glances, eyebrows raised. "She is serious, isn't she?" their expressions asked. "Okay, there you have it." She laughed in the same demeanor as a child admitting she stole her sister's hair ribbon. "Can I have my magazine back now?" "First tell us about the other husbands," Paige returned. Nanny thought a second. "If I do, will you give me back my romantic hearts?" "I promised," answered the detective. She shrugged and smiled. "It's a deal." She told them about Richard Morton, Arley Lanning, Frank Harrelson. All men whom she had first admired, but they turned out to be duds. All she ever wanted was romance, a man to love her, but instead she got what she described as dullards, each and every one of them. If their ghosts are in this room, they're either drunk or sleeping. Reporters sought Charlie Braggs to ask him questions about his marriage to Nanny.
She was always running off with one man or another, never home, and was about town more than me. And anyway, to tell the truth, I was glad when she was off. I got to a point I was afraid to eat anything she cooked. I smelled a rat.
Braggs had asked that the bodies of his 2 daughters be disinterred along with the others that the papers had listed as being suspect. But the government had obviously figured that they had enough on Mrs. Doss to send her away for a long time. The state of Oklahoma, deciding the case, centered its allegations on the death of Doss only, who died in Tulsa. The states where the litter of victims were uncovered still wanted her for the respective deaths within their jurisdiction. She was never tried outside Oklahoma, however. After a quartet of psychiatrists diagnosed her mentally sane, her trial date was set for June 2, 1955, in the Criminal Court of Tulsa, Oklahoma. But on May 17th, she decided to forget the rigmarole, and simply because her lawyers did not know how else to advise, she pled guilty. After a brief hearing, Judge Elmer Adams sentenced her to life imprisonment, barring the electric chair because of her sex. According to one family member, Nanny spent the rest of her days in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, still dreaming of eternal love. Nannie Doss died of leukemia in the prison's hospital ward in 1965. Her hopes by that time were as rusty as the armor of the knights she had known.
As we saw from this particular episode, Nannie Doss basically reaped what she sowed. She killed people, even members of her own family, for the sake of money, and others because she wasn't receiving the love and attention that she thought she deserved. Well, Nannie Doss, as you saw in the presentation, died of leukemia in 1965. An ending, I am sure most people agree, was bound to happen. Now, if you like what you saw, hit like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you'll be notified of any future episodes. Also, you can contribute to the channel, please, through PayPal, Buy Me a Cup of Coffee. We're on Rumble, Facebook, and Twitter. Until next time.